Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to make another set of Christmas cards. This time though I want to try something different. I'm going to be drawing with ink and use limited accent colors for the whole set. For the accent colors, I'm only going to use a mix of these two colors, which is Permanent Yellow Deep and Payne's Gray Bluish. I'm also going to add some gold accents using my Finetec Gold. For the full ink drawing, I'm only going to use this pen. This is my Snowman Drawing Pen. This is waterproof and the size is 0.3. Okay, so let's start straight away with the first one where I'll be drawing a couple of presents. I'm going to make two different shapes of boxes so it looks a bit more interesting. One is this cylindrical shape and the other one will just be a normal box facing the other way. For these drawings, I like to start lightly with a pencil drawing to make sure I have the correct form. Then I'm going to outline and add the textures and shadow etchings using my ink pen. This way it's less intimidating to get the shapes right straight away. I can still erase things and I'd only start to use my pen once the shapes are clear enough in my head and I have pretty clear imagination of how I would want to go about with the etching and the shadows. For me, just the basic shapes are enough, but you can also add some light shadows with pencil first in case you want to have a better visualization before making the permanent marks with pen. Everyone has their own comfort zones and you know yours best, so try to experiment and find what you're comfortable with before adding on the pen etchings. As an example here, I wasn't sure what the shadows are going to look like, so I'm going to draw it out with pencil before outlining everything. I feel like I have enough information here, so I'm going to go ahead and outline with pen. I like to start with the bow because I didn't really sketch it too accurately, but I already knew what I wanted to correct, especially how the pine leaf is going to stick out of this bow. You can see that the lines that I'm making are a little bit stiff here, but the reason why I chose a thicker line weight is so I can play with the weight as I take off a bit of pressure or add more pressure for a thicker line weight, and that's something that I noticed after etching the inside of the bow. You can see that the lines are a little bit too thick and rough, so just be mindful of that because even if you're not using a fountain pen, you can still play with the weight of your lines. Or if it's a little bit too intimidating to start straight away, you can always do a little bit of etching on a scrap piece of paper just to get used to the line weights. I like to use thicker line weights for the main outlines, but I like to break into dashed lines for the folds of the box wrapping since those edges won't be as sharp. Little changes like these I feel makes the sketch look a little bit more handmade rather than a computerized and lifeless drawing. So that's something that I'm going to try to bring across in these drawings. It's a little bit hard to remind myself to keep doing that because sometimes I'm too focused on the actual shapes. So just go slowly and try to keep these things in mind. I'm not a pro by all means. I was also trying to figure things out as I was drawing these, and I find that by following the curves and direction of the objects when adding on the etching, it really helps define the form a little bit more and it creates something a little bit more flowy like these bows. When painting, we can add textures by using different brush strokes, but this time since the colors are limited and we only have 1 point for the pen, the only way to suggest the textures is by the lines that we make and the types of markings when we add the shading. And that's something that I also tried to figure out and think about with these cards. Hopefully what I'm addressing makes sense for you since I'm not even sure of the technical terms since I don't really do these types of sketches often. So hopefully you understand what I'm doing visually here in the video since I'm not very good at describing it. And feel free to share your knowledge as well if you have any other information or comments regarding what I'm doing wrong since we're here to learn together and from each other. But yeah, once I feel like I no longer need the pencil marks, I just go ahead and erase it, then add the other shadings as well. I try to not overdo this though because I might end up covering the whole thing in black. I'm not very good at lighting and value placement, so I'm just trying to limit the amount of etching I do, but the same thing still stands. I'm just trying to follow the lines and direction of the lines as I go. For the darker areas, I try to bunch the lines closer together, and for the lighter areas, if I still want it to look a little bit darker than other parts, I would just add on lines a little bit more further apart and also a little bit more sparse and random. I'm also trying to lessen the pressure of my pen so the etching doesn't look too solid and stiff. After drawing these presents, I feel like it looks a bit too empty, so I'm going to add some decorative leaves sticking out at the back. Actually, initially when I drew this first one, I didn't think that I was going to add the green accent. I just wanted to add the gold accent, but I'm glad that that's something I'm able to end up bringing across all the designs. So in the end, it's still consistent with each other. I'm generally quite comfortable just drawing leaves freehand. However, you can always draw it out with pencil first if you feel like you need the extra guide or if you want to explore with the composition a bit more. For the darker parts of the leaves closer to the presents, instead of drawing individual leaves there, I'm going to just darken the whole area and shade it so there's more contrast to the round eucalyptus leaves. I feel like I'm quite happy with the composition, so now I'm going to add the green leaves. I'm using a mix of permanent yellow deep and Payne's gray bluish, and the color that I'm using is a fairly dark green. However, this is something that you can adjust according to the ratio. If you want lighter leaves, you can add more permanent yellow deep in the ratio. I started with a medium to light consistency, especially for the round leaves. Then I'm going to darken them so it doesn't look as flat using a thicker consistency of more or less the same green and a little bit more Payne's gray bluish in the ratio. I'm going to add the darker colors near the ends of the leaves. Then I'm going to add the gold accents. It's up to you where you want to add these accents, by the way, and it also depends on your composition. But for me, I'm just going to add it to the bows. Since I am painting on just a white surface, I'm using a medium consistency instead of something completely opaque so I don't accidentally cover the etching or the details that we drew out before. That's basically it for the first composition. I just lined the bottom so it's easier for me to write the greetings. I'm just going to write a simple Merry Christmas in all caps, but if you have any other ideas, of course, you can decorate the writing as you wish. And that's it for the first design. Now let's move on to the second one. For the second one, it's actually based off an image I found of a door decoration where they have two baubles tied with pine leaves and eucalyptus leaves. This is what the reference photo looks like. I'm just going to take the elements but make my own composition so the placement will be different. Since the main feature will be the bubbles, I drew them out first just to make sure that they're in the middle of the page. Then I'm going to draw the rest of the leaves, which is a combination of pine leaves and silver dollar eucalyptus leaves to help frame those bubbles. Since I feel quite comfortable drawing the details freehand, this sketch is just going to be simple and quick to help as a slight guide. I'm trying to visualize what the silhouette of the overall composition is going to look like, but I can still move the features around if I feel the need to as I draw with my pen. I feel like I have enough information here. It's a bit messy, but I can still work with it. I'm going to start by outlining whatever's overlapping in front, so it's a bit easier to fill in the rest of the objects. When I'm drawing out the branches of the eucalyptus leaves, it's ideal to draw the leaves first instead of the stem in the middle, so the leaves will look like they're growing in front of the stem. I try to limit the details of the leaves, if not everything will just look too dark, since the leaves of the pine trees are also very thin. So to lessen the amount of black for this particular design, I use softer pressure, and sometimes I like to mix it with some thin dashed lines when I'm adding on the details for the leaves. For this composition, I find it's a bit easier to draw the eucalyptus leaves first, then I'm going to fill in the rest of the space with the pine leaves later. Again, because the pine leaves will look very dark from the thin leaves, I'm going to just use them as fillers instead. I feel like I have a pretty good amount of eucalyptus leaves here, so I'm going to start adding on the pine leaves, and instead of just using single lines to depict the pine leaves, I try to double up the lines so at least there's a little bit of white and the pine leaves doesn't look as sharp or needle-like. Instead, it has a little bit of a body. Just like the leaves in the previous design, if there are some dark parts where there's a lot of things going on, I'm just going to shade the whole area so it doesn't look too busy, and it also helps to make the bubbles or the lighter leaves stand out a little bit more instead of fighting with the details. I quite like this triangular composition. It kind of looks like an upside down Christmas tree, so I'm going to add the accents now. I'm just going to add the light greens for the eucalyptus leaves, and just like before, I'm going to add a slightly thicker consistency of the same mix right where the leaves are connected to the stem, just for a little bit of color variation. Then I'm going to paint the bubbles using the gold. After painting them and looking at the design again, I felt like a lot of the details are fighting with each other, so I'm just going to enhance the outline of the bubbles to make them stand out a bit more. Once I'm done, just like the previous design, I'm going to finish off with the text. I'm writing it down with pencil first, so it's easier for me to space it out with pen. Once I'm done, I make sure that the pen marks are completely dry before erasing the guidelines, and that's it for the second design. For the last one, I'm going to create a combination of scents from spices, oranges, and pine leaves. The main element will be the orange slices, so I want to draw them out first and use the rest of the elements to frame them. I'm going to add a couple of cinnamon sticks tied together, some pine leaves to connect this to the previous designs, and lastly I'm going to add small cloves to scatter around the design. Since the main element will be the oranges, I made sure these have a bit more form. So I want the slices to be slightly angled, which means we can see some of the sides depending on where they're tilting. I'm also going to indicate the center so it's easier for me to draw the separate sections, which I'm going to draw freehand later, but you can also create pencil guides first if that's a bit more comfortable for you. I think that's enough information for me. I'm going to go straight to the pen outline. I'm going to start with the oranges. I'm going to only do small breaks for the outline, but for the details inside, I'm going to put less pressure and a bit more dashed lines so it doesn't fight with the main silhouette. For the visible sides, I'm going to add textures to the orange peel. I'm just going to add dots and I'm going to make the dots closer together for the shadow areas. And for the lighter areas, I made the dots a bit more sparse and further away from each other. So for this overlapped part, I'm going to darken it to separate those two shapes by adding a lot of dots close together. For the center or the white part of the oranges, I made something sort of like a star shape that is connected by curved lines radially, but I didn't really think about how many sections I'm going to divide this into. I'm just going to make it along as I go. When you're sectioning out the oranges, make sure you take good care of the angles and the lines are directed right to the center. I also like to leave a bit of white space in between the sections, but I tried to make the lines as thin as I can. As for the texture of the orange, I'm going to draw them per section. I'm going to etch the edges of each section by directing the lines to the center, just like how we directed the lines for the divisions. I'm also going to add this at the center tip of each section. Then, depending on how light or dark I want the areas to be, I'm going to make the lines closer together and also fill in more of the midsections. For the darker areas, I added more line textures, whereas for the lighter areas, instead of leaving them completely blank, I like to add a little bit of dots. And I'm just going to repeat the same steps for this next orange. Once I'm happy with the oranges, I'm going to move along to draw the cinnamon sticks. The rest of the elements here are actually quite straightforward. For the cinnamon sticks, I'm just going to draw them as they are first, then I'm going to only add a bit of shading to separate them ever so slightly. By the way, I'll still be making the outlines for these three designs and I'll leave it in my coffee shop like usual. I won't add the shading though because I think that's actually the fun part that you get to add yourself. If you want, you can also use these outlines to create complete paintings instead of this ink versions. For the leaves here, because they're bigger in scale compared to the previous ones we've drawn, I also made the placement of the leaves a bit more sparse and further apart. I'm not actually sure what these are. They're bordering on pine leaves or rosemary leaves, whichever you want them to be. But again, because the leaves are very thin, I tried using a really light pressure to create the thin outlines. And that's more or less it with the outlines. I'm just going to finish off with the cloves. I like to think of them as tiny little flowers with a thick stem, so hopefully that's a bit easier to visualize. Once I'm done, I want to make sure the ink is completely dry and erase the extra pencil marks. Then I'm going to paint the pine leaves with a green accent. And just like the previous leaves, I'm going to mix the hues of the dark and lighter green. As for the gold accent, since there are no decorations or bows here, I'm just going to paint the orange rind using the gold. I guess the rind can be painted as decoration as well. Lastly, to finish off the final design, I'm going to write the greetings the same way as I did before, and that's it for the third and final design. So that's it for this Christmas card set. I hope you enjoyed the different approach and style that is quicker and simpler to paint. I personally enjoyed this change and I might do more ink drawings in the future. Like usual, the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in the description box. If you enjoyed this tutorial or are looking for more Christmas card ideas, feel free to subscribe. Thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Bye!